Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullins, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.
Thank you, Robert, and it is a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And as I look around the room, I am truly impressed and inspired by this large group of people, but not just the size of it, the individuals who are here and who contribute in so many ways, small and large, to the state of Louisiana. So I really appreciate what all of you do every day. And I know that we can look forward to a great message from Walter Isaacson. I'm looking forward to that as well. And Robert, I want to thank you and all the folks at PAR for continuing to advance conversations about what we can do to best move our state forward. And events such as this one provide important opportunities, I believe, to share perspectives that eventually do shape policy. But your point is duly noted. I won't be putting you on any more task forces in the near future. You've served a lot of those. But I am going to keep calling you to the office to discuss things as they come up, if you don't mind. You know, we all in our own ways are striving to create a Louisiana where families can thrive and our businesses can flourish. And there is a lot of proof that we're well on our way. For the past couple of years, our economy is bouncing back. Last year, for example, per capita personal income in our state rose by 2.9%. That's above the national average. Unemployment today sits at 4.5% in our state. That's the lowest it has been in 10 years. And it's 1.2% lower than it was just a year ago. And that growth in employment, that reduction in our unemployment, is the second best in the entire country over the last year. And for the first time in a decade, we actually are funding higher education in the current fiscal year without a reduction relative to the previous year. Now, Richard Lipsey, that's pretty good, isn't it? I'm going to stop there for just a second. We're clapping because for the first time in a decade, we didn't cut higher education. What is our world going to be like when we start reinvesting in higher education? But it does mark a turning point, and it is something that we're doing today that is better than we've done in the past, so we ought to celebrate it. But I look forward to the day when we can start reinvesting in higher education. And I hope you all share my belief, and I'm convinced that I'm right. Of course, I'm convinced that I'm right all the time. Economic development, investment, job creation today and going forward will forever be inextricably linked to higher education. Because if you don't have the educated, skilled, knowledgeable employees for employers to know they can invest their money safely in Louisiana and have the talent pool that they need to be successful, it just isn't going to happen. And so we have to make sure that going forward we are committed to higher education. That stability ensures the training of skilled workers that has helped us land significant economic development projects. In fact, 43 projects throughout the state in 2017 alone, including DXC Technologies in New Orleans, which will create 2,000 permanent jobs, the second best economic deal in the country last year and the best in our state's history when it comes to direct permanent jobs at one site. And I can assure you it would not have happened but for the fact that for the first time in a decade, we did stabilize our support for higher education. We continue to be ranked among the top 10 states for economic development investment, according to Site Selection magazine. And area development ranks Louisiana in the top 5 states for doing business. And Thumbtack says we're in the top 4 for small business friendliness and gave us an A+ rating. And so we're getting a taste of what's possible when we work together. And by the way, for the first time in a long time, we actually have a little surplus from the last fiscal year that we're talking about. We have excess right now accumulated in the current fiscal year because our forecasts are lower than the revenue that's actually coming in. So we've turned a corner in Louisiana. The question is, are we going to continue on this path, which I hope we will, believe we need to do, and by the way, it can be easily done, or are we not? By the way, I recently announced a plan to reinvest in critical priorities across the state of Louisiana using nearly $122.6 million in surplus from the fiscal year that ended June 30th of 2017. Now, the Constitution tells us what we can do with that money. For instance, it's one-time money, and so it can only be spent on one-time expenses, and that's what we're going to do. But even with our constitutional obligations being met, we're going to be able to make real investment in our future that we haven't seen in quite a while. For example, transportation and infrastructure projects awaiting funding in our highway program, our priority program, are going to be funded. Deferred maintenance on state and university buildings that have been woefully neglected, and now we have a $3 billion backlog just on deferred maintenance needs. Local projects currently in the capital outlay program, we will be able to fund them with cash so we don't take and bond them out and pay 20 years on something that's a relatively small project that we can actually do now. We're also going to increase our support for local governments through the LGAP program and the Community Water Enrichment Fund. I also want to talk a little bit about an initiative that we have, and it's particularly timely today for anybody who tried to get here on I-12. I'm sorry, on I-10. That's why I walked in as the introductions were being made. The Garvey Bond Initiative that Sean Wilson, Secretary of the Department of Transportation, recently announced, and that has received approval at the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget. What we intend to do is advance $550 million worth of capacity projects, the three most important projects in the state of Louisiana in the short term, but that require significant investment, and do that by encumbering 10% of our federal TTF dollars for up to 12 years, but to deliver three critical projects. One is the widening of I-10 from the Mississippi River to the 10-12 split. The others are a new interchange at I-20 at Barksdale Air Force Base. We actually have a 4-star nuclear command at Barksdale that sits right beside I-20, and there is no interchange that services Barksdale for ingress and egress. And finally, we have a $1 billion airport being built in New Orleans that'll come online sometime in about a year, and we don't have a really good transportation system to get to and from there from I-10. So we're looking at a new flyover in Kenner to make sure that that happens. We also had a very positive announcement yesterday, and that has to do with disaster recovery funding from HUD, and Community Development Block Grant funding of $1.2 billion additional to what we had been appropriated earlier. And we're going to be able to advance an awful lot of projects to make us more resilient in terms of our ability to withstand future flooding events and strengthen our communities. And certainly we are going to be making sure that we'll continue to work with the Corps of Engineers to more quickly deliver the Comeet River diversion. So the only thing standing in the way of having more opportunities to make key investments and keep our state on the path that we're on right now, which I'm convinced is the right way to go, is we have to fix the fiscal cliff. As you know, I called a special session in February in order to address the $1.38 billion in expiring revenue that falls off the books on June 30th. And I think it's important that everybody understand what the cliff is. We don't have a problem because revenue isn't coming in as forecasted. In fact, it's the opposite. We don't have a problem because our expenditures have exceeded what we planned on. We have a problem because we have temporary revenue that just falls off the books on June the 30th. It's right at $1.4 billion. Now, my plan is to keep $994 million of that so we can adequately fund our critical priorities. So what does that sound like to you? It sounds like a net reduction in a tax burden in the state of Louisiana by $400 million from this year to next. You likely haven't heard of it in those terms, but that's exactly what my plan does. And you should know that even at $994 million, we will make $120 million in cuts in state general fund because the $994 million just represents keeping us the same next year in general fund as we are this year. And there are certain parts of our budget that go up. We have no control over that. And in order to accommodate those cost increases, we will make reductions elsewhere. So even at the number that I am requesting, there's $120 million in reductions in state general fund expenditures. But those expenditures, I should say, those reductions won't be as deep or as widespread, obviously, if we don't fix any part of the cliff that we have. Now, we did get some benefits from the federal tax changes that occurred in December, and I expect that the revenue for next year will be increased by about $300 million or so because of that change. So the number we're looking at is really in the neighborhood of $700 million. But we need to fix it so we can properly fund our critical priorities like health care, like TOPS, like higher education, like law enforcement. Now, unfortunately, there were some who stood in the way and prevented us from making progress on this front in the special session that we concluded just a few weeks ago. And last year we had a fiscal session, the last scheduled fiscal session before the fiscal cliff. And in neither of these two sessions did a single bill pass out of the House of Representatives and get to the Senate to address the cliff. And quite frankly, we have to do better. This is already causing uncertainty to our state, to students and parents and businesses and hospitals that we could have and really should have avoided. In fact, I met with a young man yesterday. He comes from Ascension Parish. He's an Eagle Scout. He made a 33 on his ACT. He's sitting there with an offer from the University of Alabama for a scholarship that he doesn't want to take, but it's better than anything he has in his hand right now from LSU, which is where he wants to go. And the members of his immediate family have earned over 40 degrees from LSU, and this young man thinks he's probably going to have to go to Alabama. And it should upset us every bit as much, in fact more, when we lose our best and brightest to the University of Alabama than it is when we lose to them on the football field. We have to do something, and we need to do it now because it's too late to do it when we should have. So why is it so hard to make these reductions and do it in a responsible way? Because of the $9.4 billion in state general fund, there's about $3.4 billion of that that's discretionary. And the big pots of spending that you can reduce happen to be in health care and higher education. Precisely the two areas that people all over the state of Louisiana tell me every single day they do not want to see us cut. Now, the President and the Speaker and I agreed earlier that we ought to end the regular session early so that we can call a special session. That is the biggest priority for the state of Louisiana, and have that special session end by June 4th, which is the scheduled end date for the regular session, so that we can fix this problem, do so a month ahead of when the new fiscal year starts. And so that's what we're working to do. But we still have plenty to do in this regular session as well, like addressing poverty and moving families out of poverty by creating a Moving Families from Poverty to Empowerment strategic plan. I happen to believe it's a mistake that the legislature thus far has failed to move the minimum wage bill and the equal pay bill. Look, $7.25 in 2018 is not a meaningful wage. And Congress is out of the business of raising the minimum wage. If it's going to happen, we're going to have to do it ourselves. I believe we ought to do it. I think it ought to be moved to $8.50 over 2 years. And the fact that we have the largest wage gap based on gender in the country at 66 cents on the dollar ought to offend each and every person in this room and beyond. We ought to fix that. We ought to give regulatory relief for businesses and professionals by establishing an occupational licensing review, and we ought to start by repealing the licensing requirement for florists. I think the market can determine who can arrange flowers. We ought to continue to support small business. Small businesses account for 99.5% of our jobs in the private sector, and we're going to create the Louisiana Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. So these are just some of the things that we're working on, but I want to thank you again for your hard work, for your involvement, for your contributions to the state of Louisiana, and for PAR's partnership in making sure that we do keep our eyes fixed on what's most important in our state. And I'm going to ask you to encourage your legislators, both in the House and the Senate, to work to get things done. We have to come together. And I am optimistic. I remain as optimistic and bullish about the future of Louisiana as ever, despite these challenges that we have, because I know that we're going to come together and get this done. And on the other side of these challenges is an era of prosperity like we haven't seen in a long time here. We just have to summon the courage to make the hard choices that are right. And sometimes leadership requires that you choose from the least bad of difficult options. But if that's what the situation is, then that, by God, is what we have to do. And delaying and putting it off only makes it worse. It only makes it worse. I'll just share this with you. Some of the things that we should have done in February, because we didn't do them, even if we do them in June, the fiscal note is smaller. And so we now have to do more to fix the problem for next year. Waiting exacerbates. It solves nothing. And so let's pull together. Let's come together as Louisianans. You know, next year is the election year. We can get back to being Republicans and Democrats then, but we ought to come together now, fix our problems as Louisianans, and move forward together and create the opportunity we want in our great state for our kids and grandkids right here, so that they never feel like they have to leave our state to get a good education, to find a good job, or to have a rewarding career. That's what our mission is. We can do it. We're going to do it with your help and with your prayers. God bless you. Thank you very much.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullens, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.